But all of them are afraid of even answering, afraid that even the slightest noise would set these things off and they would be torn to bits. In tonight's episode, I'm going to be reading to you a series of user-submitted stories. Get ready, because these are pretty crazy. This story takes place in 2019 in a cul-de-sac, about 6 houses down from the eyewitness's house. They would go by the name James. James was getting a ride from a good friend, and with the COVID-19 restrictions, they weren't exactly supposed to be hanging out, as well as the curfew that was in town at the time. It was about 1:10 in the morning, and the streets were so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. They're driving around the neighborhood, and as they rounded a corner, James's friend would slow the car to a stop, and he hits James on the arm and says, "Bro, what is that?" And as James turns to look out his passenger side window, he didn't get that far, as right in front of the car, in front of the passenger side, through the windshield, he sees what he would describe as a woman, but dressed in all black. And not like in a dress, but black pants and a blouse that seemed to be flowing in the wind with a way that he could only describe best as a black garment, as the parts weren't directly on her body, but was see-through, as it was very thin material. Now, her hair was this greasy, matted black, and with the wind blowing, so was her hair, and so you can kind of see part of her face. Now, James had talked about her lips being black as if she had chose to wear pitch black lipstick, but her skin was so fair, it almost seemed pale. Now, she stood directly in front of the car, but on James's side, the passenger side. And this woman was facing straight towards him, as if she wanted James to know that he was her next target. And he tried his best to identify her by getting a good look at her face, but when he tried to look into her eyes through parts of her hair, he was shook because there was simply nothing there. I mean, there were no eyes, nothing, no sockets, just white, pale skin where eyes should be. And he's sitting there kind of like almost taken aback, thinking that his eyes are merely playing tricks on him, and he tries to get a closer look, focusing his eyes, straining to try and see hers. And that's when she smiles at him. It was the most sinister, heart-stopping grin he wished he had never seen. And when this happened, he kind of just sat there and froze for a moment, not sure if this was a human being or not. And he couldn't believe what he was seeing because no person has these features. I mean, he was speechless, to say the least. And he feels this cold chill run right up his spine, all the way to the back of his neck, and all the hair on the back of his neck starts standing straight up. And the only thought in his head at that time was, there's no way this is real. After a few seconds, which felt like an hour without taking his eyes off of her, he gathered himself enough and said as calmly as he could to his friend, "Dude, drive, now go." And they just bolted down the road, driving around. Now, she kept her eyes on him as they passed and refused to look at her again. He immediately looked back using the side view mirror, and it was indirect, but then adjusted it so he could look into the rearview mirror, and there was nothing there. She had just completely vanished without a trace. I mean, no signs of her anywhere. So he freaks out again and says to his friend, "Dude, she's gone. I don't even know what to think." So James, his friend, pulls up to his house, waits for him to get out, and enters his house. And then his friend is so freaked out, he speeds off himself. I mean, James could hear his transmission going into at least third gear as he's ripping down the street. And he could not sleep at all that night. So he kept his room lights on and his dog as close to him as possible till the morning, just to try and feel safe. As soon as he felt safe, almost like he was obsessed with pulling out his iPad and immediately trying to look up what this woman in black was, because he did not believe that this was a human being he had encountered. He knew deep down, his body knew, his mind knew, his spirit knew that he had dealt with something of the supernatural. What his research had indicated was that this woman, or entity, appears as a woman in black and shows herself to men who appear to be out late when they're not supposed to be. For example, when a man or a group of men are out having drinks late at night when they're supposed to be home with their wives and children. And as soon as he read this, James just got really creeped out, getting goosebumps all over his arms, all over his head, because this is exactly what they were doing that night, just completely goofing off. Now, a few more days go by this point, and James is completely unsure of what causes all this sudden anxiety of what he had seen earlier, because he felt shook still from the memory. And it was so vivid that this entity had tried to latch itself onto him, or so James believes. And then he has this very intense dream that he was standing by the front door of his house and thought somebody was outside. So in his dream, he opens the door, steps outside to check to see if anybody was there, but his yard is empty. And so he just figures, you know what the heck? He goes back inside, turns around to lock the door, but before he could even manage that, that same entity or woman is pressing her face and body against the glass part of the door with her mouth wide open as if she was trying to say something to scare him. And in his dream, he just then rages at her and yells, "What are you gonna do, huh?" Almost taunting or challenging her. And so she takes her face off the glass and leaves, understanding that he would not allow her to manipulate him or get into his head. And he woke up, and all that feeling of dread and fear that he had the entire week felt like it had just washed away. So he tells his stepmom about the experience and the dream later that day, and informs me that she's from Fiji and heavily believes in the supernatural. And so she just stared at James a little longer, looking scared herself, when she tells James that it was a good thing he did not open the door again in his dream, because it can represent a door or a portal or some sort of opening in his mind that would allow this entity to go through to attach itself to James. That this thing wants to live again and will try and do anything it can to scare you into letting that happen. And the simple fact that James had managed to challenge this entity was the reason it decided to leave him alone. If he had somehow appeared weak or vulnerable, it would have been a different situation, and this entity would be trying to torment him to a point of complete and total submission. What sort of entity do you guys believe that James encountered that night? This story submitter goes by the name of Tyson, who has lived on the panhandle of Florida for the last 50 years now. He has traveled the state of Florida since he has been old enough to drive, and lives in the area Eglin Air Force Base, which is the largest land military base in the United States. Now, he's told me he's seen some awkward stuff all along the panhandle, but one situation that happened in 1992 has always stood out to Tyson. His story goes that he was a young man in his young 20s with a good friend of his, just hanging out one night, doing nothing, probably just driving around, joking, laughing, and they were feeling themselves, right? No worries in the world, as young men would be. And his father was actually a high-ranking official out on the base. And so he claims that they were young and dumb, just on a late-night ride, just joking around. His friend had an early modeled 4Runner that was fairly new, and they really wanted to take it out on the reservation and use the 4-wheel drive. They were not drinking or under the influence of drugs or doing anything nonsensical. They simply just wanted to go 4-wheeling and have a good time. It was late, it was around midnight, the moon was high up in the sky, so there was somewhat visibility, even though it was still pretty dark. And they're just being silly, doing nothing much on consequence. And so as they're driving down the road, Highway 285, listening to music and chilling with the windows down, they see a deer running across the road at a pretty normal pace. No biggie. So he broke, not rapidly but abruptly, and they slowed down to about 15 miles an hour because they were surprised they saw a big deer streaking across the road. And so as they're watching this deer pass from left to right, they both saw something off to the right of the road. And what they saw was something that made both Tyson and his friend look at each other in complete confusion and terror. The wood line was probably no more than 30 feet on both sides, and what they saw comes out of the brush. It was something they could never imagine. It was this strange bipedal figure, probably about 7 feet tall, dark, hairy, chasing after this deer. And it stops about 10 feet from the road for a moment as they had passed. Windows were down, so they both were looking eye to eye right at this being, and Tyson just expresses how this was just creepy beyond thought. And as they passed by this thing, they were only doing roughly 15 to about 20 miles an hour, so they only got a quick glance. But after they passed, Tyson and his friend just look at each other with their mouths wide open. They're both like, what the heck was that? Throws his head quickly out the window to get a second glance at whatever this thing was, because it was simply unlike anything either of them had ever seen. Creepy, large, hairy, it had a wolf-like face but a bended knee stance, had brownish black hair that was long. He didn't recall seeing any claws or any hands, but They were up like it was stopping short of running in front of the moving car, kind of like a pause stance, he says. Even though its arms were raised in a mid-torso stance, it was dark, so it was kind of hard to see. So they both freak out and take the next left down a dirt road. It was probably a half mile down the road, and they just drove to get away from this thing, not really sure why they thought taking a road to the left would somehow make the situation any better, let alone a dirt road, but that's just what they did. Tearing it up all the way down, headed towards the Air Force Base. They're roughly about 2 minutes along the road, and all of a sudden, an MP pulls out and pops their lights on. And so Tyson and his friends stop, and the next thing you know, they see 2 more MPs pulling up. The MP gets him out, and he's very aggressive at first, asking all these questions that one of authority would. Who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you here? Etc. And they're still freaking out, reeling from the trauma of just seeing whatever that freakish science experiment was just mere minutes ago, and now they're trying to address this situation calmly and collectively. But after a minute or so, one of the MPs saw the full bird colonel sticker on the windshield. That was Tyson's father, and he was second in charge on the Air Force Base. So after the MPs realized this and that Tyson and his friend were not up to no good, everybody just sort of relaxed and tensions were completely eased. About 1 minute goes by, and they all heard this heavy rustling in the woods. And Tyson explains just how heavy it was, and so everything turned in that moment to the woods. Because in total, there were 6 MPs, 3 SUVs, and Tyson's friend and him, and they're all looking in this direction in response to the noise now in the woods, and everybody all sees what Tyson and his friend just saw 15 minutes beforehand. The MPs only had their flashlights out, but had ARs on their shoulder as well, but everybody just kind of stopped and stared and was in complete shock at what they were seeing. It was only a brief 5 seconds, but what they saw was not anything anybody has ever seen. This being had moved so quickly through the woods. It was large and black and moved with very little effort, like it was made to be a killing machine. It was almost so quick that when it happened, we were all just shocked and didn't know what to say. So now after that moment happened, everybody's just kind of standing there for a moment, and about a minute goes by, and the MPs just look right at Tyson and his friend and just says, "Guys, get on out of here." You know, everyone's still wide-eyed and just in shock, so Tyson just said, "Okay." And as he's walking away, getting back in his vehicle to go back down the road, getting away from them, Tyson turns to one of the MPs and just says, "Did you see that?" And the MP, remaining completely unfazed, just tells Tyson, "Don't worry about what you think you saw. Forget about it." And so they left after that. Now, 3 days later, Tyson was pulled out of one of his college classes and was asked about what he saw. Now, here's what's creepy, is that he tells these people, which I'll get to in a second, that he believes he saw a bear or maybe a wild boar, but he wasn't quite sure what he saw. But Tyson went on to describe these guys that pulled him out of class and questioned him aggressively, that they looked like men in black, straight-faced, no mood, kind of glossy flesh, just very dry, and it freaked Tyson out a lot for the last 30 years. Is it possible that Tyson and his friend saw a creature from the supernatural realm? What do you think? This story was submitted to me by an anonymous user, and he described that his uncle and his friend went camping 1 hour north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, back in the early 1990s. This campground that they were at was huge and nowhere near humans. The guy who works at the campground showed them a map of the area to his uncle and his friend and tells them they can camp anywhere you want, but you can't camp at this part of the park right here on the map. Now, a few days later, and they packed up and moved to another section of the park just for a change of view. But they completely forgot about the spot they were told not to camp. And yes, it's exactly what happens. They camp in that exact spot. So that night, when it was dark out, and their claim is that they heard and saw a huge hairy man-like thing about 10 feet tall trying to untie the knot from their food that they had over a 15-foot branch so animals could not get to it. Now, if you didn't know, tying your food up and throwing it over a branch is a very common practice in the woods to keep your food away from bears and other animals, so this is what they were doing. His uncle and his friend were so deep into the woods at this point that it took 3 days of walking, 8 hours per day, to even get to this spot where they had camped. And his uncle and his friend took their axes and began to run and charge at this huge hairy thing, figuring that, hey, 2 against 1, we could probably win. considering that was their only food and they were about 3 days away from any food source. This creature began to run away as soon as the uncle and friend began to chase it with the axe. But the uncle claims that the thing that scared him the most was when they were chasing this thing, they had heard a sound from behind them, and they would have run right by the second one without even knowing it was there. The two of these beings leave, and the uncle and friend end up staying up all night, scared in their tents, waiting for these creatures to come back. Once the morning came, they finally packed up everything and left right away. And both said they felt like they were being watched the entire time. And a few days after, they finally got back to their car and talked to the man who worked at the camp and told him that they stayed at the spot that they were told not to camp at. And they never said anything about the two Bigfoots, but the guy who worked there had his jaw wide open and just said, "You didn't get killed?" And so the person who submitted this story realizes they're leaving out a lot of details, but they were told the story 2 years ago, and that's all they remember, but that their uncle listens to the show, and he's heard about people talking about huge rocks being tossed into the water, and said that that happened to him on the Grand River just outside of Ontario. So what do you guys think? An actual encounter with a Bigfoot creature, or simply just their imagination? This story was submitted to me by a man named Craig, who claims this story is 100% true. He would go on to explain that about 10 years ago, he lived virtually in the middle of nowhere and could literally take any old gravel mining road all the way to his nearest Walmart. And at this time of the story, he was working third shift, so his hours were just different. And so one night, he was driving down these basically one-lane gravel roads on his way to a said Walmart, and gets within about 2 miles or so when he comes upon another truck just sitting there in the middle of the road. And thinking that maybe something's wrong, he creeps up beside this truck on the driver's side, looking over to see if everything is okay, because that's what a good Samaritan would do if you just saw a truck sitting in the middle of nowhere. And immediately, Craig can see that the female in the passenger side seat is freaking out for some reason, and the driver, a male, is trying to calm her down, and this woman was hysterical, crying and panicking. Not only can you see the expression on her face, but you could see her body movements and her language. Clearly something had shaken this woman, but Craig has no idea what's going on, so he thinks there might be an emergency going on, and so he's trying to get the driver's attention and finally gets that attention, asking, is everything okay? What's going on? Is there anything I can help you with? And the driver now starts freaking out, just saying, "It's a witch, man. It's a effing witch." And he points over to the left, across from Craig to the empty field. And so Craig, completely confused by what he's being told, looks over to where he's pointing, and what he sees baffles him. He sees this completely naked, super pale woman running through this field, and Craig watches her run through this field into the direct path of a truck that was going through an intersection in front of him, and she just vanishes into thin air. And he's not ashamed to say that he did not hang around to see if the people in the other truck were okay, and he simply took off like a bat out of hell. This story was submitted to me by a gal who lives down under and who wishes to remain anonymous. Now, she went on to tell me about Wawina and how this was a high alternative school in the inner western suburbs of Sydney, Australia. It began as an old shipping terminal in Balmain and moved to Callan Park/Roselle Hospital, which is also a mental asylum. And so halfway during their time there, this is where the story takes place. Now, it's not really paranormal per se, but it's very creepy and ultimately sad. They had just moved to the school to Roselle Hospital, which again is a mental asylum, the year's 1983 to be precise. And a bunch of 15-ish kids wandered off from the school looking for an adventure. And at this time, she was a very troubled teen, always getting into trouble. Even though 10th grade could prove to be a tumultuous time for any teen, they noticed days before there was an old chapel, all boarded up, and so they managed to peer through the gaps in the boards and through the stained glass windows to see an old dusty stack of chairs and a stage, and above the stage at some height there was also another row of stained glass windows, but it had a ledge about 3 or so feet wide. They were successful in prying off some boards when they noticed a small door behind them. And so they pushed the door, and to their surprise, it simply wasn't locked. They were able to gain immediate entry, and they got in. Their group consisted of about roughly 8 to 10, although she can't fully recall the number. And they're all thinking how cool it would be to have another hideout from the teachers and, of course, schoolwork in general. A couple of the kids had joints with them and they wanted to share it with everybody, and so they all began to light these joints in hand and begin to pass them around. And so they're all sitting in a circle now on this polished floor, but covered in dust still, and they're talking and they're teasing each other just, as kids would typically do at that age. One of the kids in the group noticed a rag type thing hanging from a circular window right above the stage, and it looked as if it was attached to something. And so a few of the taller teenagers there, the girl telling the story was short, so she wasn't able to do it, but she grabbed the chairs and stood on them to try and get a better look at what this object was hanging off the ceiling, and it looked like some sort of material maybe from a suitcase was up there. And so they're all chatting, talking about what they think it could be, trying to work out what it was in the suitcase, when somebody got the great idea to do a human pyramid below it and send this tiny girl up the pile of human beings to have a look. And so they tried a few times, but mostly unsuccessful, trying to keep themselves together. However, they were fortunately able to kind of steady out, and she began to climb all the way up. And so she's kind of looking into the area, but not really all that much concentrating on getting themselves up the human pile. And she sees the ledge and manages to pull herself up and sit on it. When she's able to do that, she turns around and is completely overtaken by horror and lets out a scream as she sees this mummified human being sitting there next to the stained glass window. And its knees and legs were curled up like it died, or they died, in the fetal position, and its head was definitely a man's head. The skin looked like an old leather and split all over, exposing bone. Eyes sunken in, some teeth exposed, dried up lips peeling back, reddish short hair, and he looked as if he was wearing pajamas. They were striped with faded blue lines, and one of his bony hands firmly gripped a suitcase. And so she recalled the full description down to the human pile beneath her and looks down to see all these kids barreling out, running away, as the school buddies realized what exactly she was telling them was up there. And as she looked closely at this suitcase, it was very old. She estimates it was probably in the 1940s and had an Australian Army emblem on it. It was brown and leather, very dusty. But no matter how much she could try, she was not able to pry the suitcase off of his dead rigor mortis hands, and so she calls down to her one friend and begged them to get her the F down from there. Eventually, they were able to get themselves together enough to make the human pile again and quickly scramble down. Then she tells one of the guys at the top to go have a look himself because she cannot believe what they just found. She just kept stating over and over how she was just in complete disbelief by what she had seen. So the pile shifts a little more, and one of the boys at the bottom, one of the smaller ones, makes his way to the top, and he screams in horror seeing this human mummy. And the next thing you know, the whole pile of people all fall again on the floor, all looking sore and bewildered, and they just stand around talking, not sure what to do now because they just found a human corpse. And they all come to the mutual agreement that, look, if we go get help, we're all basically turning ourselves in for pot smoking and breaking and entering. However, after more discussion, they finally come to an agreement that the man needed to be found, and so they're all like, you know what, let's go back to the school, we'll just tell them the whole story. And so the police finally come, they take statements, and fortunately for the kids, they weren't really in that much trouble. They were given strict warnings, but that was about it. And the school made each one of these kids call their parents, tell them what they had done, but more importantly, tell them what they had found. And so all these kids are begging the police, please come and tell us the story of this man. How did he die? Why was he here? And we felt that this family of this unidentified man was owed an explanation of where he went. So the police go away, and everybody kind of just forgets about the situation because there's no new information given at this time. So a couple months go by, and when everybody's completely forgotten about it, all the same group of kids are ripped from class suddenly when they're asked to go to the rooms to have a nice chat with the police. These aren't necessarily the most well-behaved kids in general. These are very troubled kids, usually having bad family situations or having very bad experiences with the police, so you can imagine this was not exactly easy. So the main girl, she's trembling, she's shaking, she's thinking, I did something wrong, I'm gonna have to go to juvie, I'm gonna get arrested, something's bad. So they get there, and she notices just how solemn the police are looking, and she thinks, oh crap, And so the police sergeant begins to talk about the man that had died that they had all found 2 months prior, telling these kids, we have his name, it was David, and he was actually a soldier in World War II, and he fought against the Japanese. Apparently, this man was a prisoner of war and subjected to daily torture and starvation. And eventually he made his way back to Australia alive, but suffered from severe shell shock and PTSD, and was committed to the asylum for that and wrote to his relatives daily on how he just wanted to go home. And after 15 years in the early 1960s, he was successful in escaping this ward, trying to go home, but as it seems, they concluded that he probably suffered a heart attack or a stroke while hiding up in that round window. And they asked the police what the suitcase was full of, and one of the female officers said everything he owned. And she went on to say that he didn't own much: 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts and a jacket, and about 2 pounds in old cash and coins. And from what little they were able to find out about this David, they were able to determine that he had somehow escaped and began to start a new life somewhere. Although his wife and then children would continue to look for him, having no resolution or conclusion about where David had gone, but expressed to these kids just how grateful they were for finding him and returning him to his family. It also appeared too that when he had died, he was roughly about 47 years of age and had been up there for roughly about 20 years all by himself. And so after the police left, all the kids go down and they're all talking about what had happened, and they're still in shock about what they had found and what David had turned out to be, that at one point he was a real living person who had his own story and managed to escape, but unfortunately died up there. And so a few months pass, and the school is putting on a nightly performance, and so the parents are there, they're applauding the kids, and the night went really well. And she claims that everything was pretty normal until it was darker at night, and that round window by the chapel began to glow this light. And everybody could see easily this dark building through the trees at the top of the hill, and they all look up in shock, and just at this window where they had found the man, and all these kids are seeing this glow and a bright light, and they're believing this is 100% supernatural. They believe that it's David's spirit and he had somehow found peace. And it's stories like this that just go and show you how many people are probably never found or never will be. This story was submitted to me by a man who calls himself Zachary. He wanted to firmly warn in the beginning of this story that this is why you should never go out into the deep woods without some form of protection or another, especially during the nighttime, and that to protect the identities of his friends, they will all be given fake names. He has also sought all of their permission to share this story with me and has been granted so. So Zachary and his group of friends live in southwestern Ohio, and at the time in the group, it was Zach, his best friend Joel, their buddy Pete, and his brother Sam. It's a pretty rural area, so the woods were really nothing new, and they usually went on walks to the woods to avoid everyday drama of high school and dealing with parents and whatever life would throw at them. And so one night, Sam had texted them asking, "Hey, we should meet up at the woods right near my house." And normally this wouldn't be a problem for Zachary and his friends, but it was almost 10 p.m. at night, and it was on a school night, so he was a little concerned but decided to agree. So Zachary and his friends, they all grabbed their hiking gear, expecting this to be a several-hour rendezvous, and they meet up a little bit later. Sam and Pete were obviously upset by something, and Zach could see it. And Zachary had wanted to ask them, but figured, you know what, I'll probably just wait. Maybe they'll tell me when the time is ready and they're open to talking about it, figuring that's why they wanted to meet up in the first place. And so Joel wasn't really that happy being woken up at 10 and made that known to all of them. And so he turns to Sam and says, "Why did you have us come all the way out here? It's too late for this." And Sam, being very vague and stoic and cryptic, simply pushes past him and explains to everybody that, listen, once we're deep enough in the woods, we'll explain everything. And confused by this, Zachary and Joel just go along with Sam and Pete, and as they're walking, Zachary pulls Pete back a bit and starts asking him, "What's going on? What's with all this cryptic stuff?" And Pete just simply explains, "Look, man, it's nothing. Just some stuff at home that we just want to get off our chest," completely trying to downplay any suspicions. Zachary's not really one to get scared easily, and especially when it comes to the supernatural or anything like that. I mean, this is a guy who grew up watching horror movies with his brothers, and they made sure to scare the crap out of him when he was young, but he admits that walking to the woods this night wasn't exactly his ideal situation, so he's just focusing on moving forward, keeping his eyes in front of him and on Joel as they marched forward like it was nothing. And eventually, they came to a small clearing that they had camped at a few times before, and they all decided that, hey, this is a great place to rest. And Joel, the more irritable of the group, is just wanting answers, and so he asks Sam, why are we out here this late? What's going on? I want answers. He's pretty irritated at this point. And Sam, having a hard time speaking, just looks very uncomfortable. He's got his arms wrapped around his torso like he's in pain, and he kept his head down, and Zachary and Joel are thinking, dude, what's going on with you? And so Zach is now asking, trying to be calm and understanding, and Pete just puts his hand on Sam's shoulder, and he seemed to calm down a bit and begin to tell them everything. Apparently what had happened is that Sam and Pete's father had come home late after his shift and began drinking almost immediately. Things had quickly escalated when their mother tried to get him to go to bed. So Sam thought he was going to hit her in a drunken rage and got in the way, and it left a pretty nasty bruise on his ribs, and he had some trouble going any faster than a light jog. Joel and Zachary, completely taken aback by what they just learned, are shocked and saddened by this, and Joel just says, dude, I'm sorry, I should have guessed it was something like that. But this had not been the first time that something like this had happened. Pete and Sam's father was a known drunk, and the only reason he was not in jail was because their mother simply refused to press any charges against him, therefore enabling his behavior. Sam, who kept trying to downplay the whole thing, just said, you know what, it's okay guys, I'll be fine. I just want to get away from there for a bit and just be out here. Zachary, who's kind of more the typical high school pothead type, thought it was a good idea to bring out some weed with him that he was carrying in his bag, and figured that that would kind of help de-escalate the situation and calm everybody down, putting everybody in a much more calm headspace. Pete, though, decided to opt out since he didn't want to get all overly paranoid, especially being out in the dark woods at night. And so all three of them, minus Pete, decided to partake in smoking weed for the next hour until it was time to pack up and leave. But Sam was really reluctant to go back and knew that if he did not get home soon, his dad would start to notice and begin looking around. Now, the way back was pretty normal until they heard a branch snap, just a few feet to their left. They assumed it was just a squirrel or possibly an owl and kept walking because remember, they're high and they're overly paranoid, but they're still able to validate to each other that they heard a noise, which they all did, and then not long after, they hear another snap. And this time it was to their right and not their left, and it sounded much closer than the last one. Now Pete, the only sober one, was able to point his flashlight, and they just barely caught a glimpse of a massive hairy creature with what they would describe as golden orange eyes standing upright next to a tree before it takes off in the opposite direction. They're all exclaiming and freaking out, yelling, "What the hell was that thing?" While Sam begins muttering that it looked like a giant wolf of some kind. And so now Joel pulls out his flashlight and he's looking all around. They're all freaking out. They're expecting to see more eyes or more of these things around, but there's nothing there. And now they're trying to calm themselves down, thinking it was probably just a black bear or something. They weren't really convinced that that thing, whatever it was, looked nothing like a bear though, and Zachary stands by that. And so they decide that, you know what, we better keep walking if we want to get home at a good time. So they keep going, and now they're going at a much faster pace than before, and they're all keeping their flashlights out because now at this point, none of them are taking a risk going in the dark by themselves. And so they're shining it in every which way, in every direction, just trying to keep their surroundings lit up and illuminated as best they can, hoping that whatever was out there would see that and keep its distance, or possibly be scared of being exposed by the light. And Zach firmly states they were wrong, because soon enough, Zach's light caught another one of those things to their left, and it was just standing there like it was watching them, like it wasn't sure what they were or why we were there. And his claim is that it didn't run, it didn't move, it just stood there breathing heavily through its muzzle. And now they all had gotten a better look at this thing. They can definitely tell that it was not a bear. I mean, this being was massive, at least 9 feet tall, matted black fur covering its entire body. Its arms looked too long for its body, and each finger had a long claw that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. Its teeth were jagged and black at the tips, and its eyes were this deep yellow. And Zach felt like he couldn't get away from it or look away, and he felt like he's in a trance staring at it. And so he's completely frozen in place, and he manages to squeak out, "Guys." And they all turn around, and Sam sounded like he was about to soil his pants. And so now they all turn around, staring at this thing, wondering, what should we do at this point? And Pete is saying we should definitely not run because that is not going to end well. Because this wasn't any animal they knew. Because this wasn't any known animal they've ever heard of or seen, and it was definitely a predator by the looks of things. Running meant certain death, and Zach did not even begin to realize there might be more of them until they heard a snap from behind them, and so Sam turns around and sees another one of them, and this time, the one with the golden orange eyes they saw before, and he notices a scar running down its face, and this thing is now just a few feet away, but all of them are afraid of even answering, afraid that even the slightest noise would set these things off and they would be torn to bits. And so the one in front of them begins to kind of raise its head and start sniffing the air, grunting and chuffing like it smelled something that it liked. And they both got down on all fours and began to circle them, moving slowly, never taking their eyes off them, kind of looking at them like they're the next meal. Pete's freaking out the most at this point, just screaming, "What do we do, guys? What do we do? We're gonna die." And so Zach has his hand on his only weapon that he has, which is a mere pocket knife, knowing full well that is not going to do anything against these beings. And these things are looking ready to pounce, but a loud scream went off somewhere in the distance. But this wasn't any normal scream though. It sounded deep and guttural and inhuman, and the way Zachary described it was like it came from the pits of hell itself. And so these two beings look back at each other, look back at the boys, and then back to each other, and then take off so quickly in the direction of the scream, they could barely even keep track. All the while, after they disappear from sight, Joel is freaking out, saying, "What were those things? I don't even want to stick around here to find out. I want to go now." And there wasn't much chatter then or trying to figure out what they saw. They all just take off running back the way they came until they get to the backyard, which fortunately wasn't too far away. And in light of the situation, all four of them decide to stay the night at Zachary's place, refusing to leave the house for any reason, not even Pete and Sam's parents. Thankfully, Zachary's mom did not question it. She didn't mind. She just allowed it to happen, thinking the boys were just scared. And that was the last time any four of them would really go into the woods at night, and they could hardly sleep without worrying about what those things were. This is an experience that had scared Zachary so badly that it caused him to move away, far away from any forested or rural areas, and plants himself deep within the city for his safety. Joel, Pete, and Sam also followed in his same footsteps, keeping away from any wooded or rural areas, all while trying their best to stay in touch and still figure out what they saw that night. Collectively, they've tried to do as much research as they can, but they're not sure what they believe they encountered. It could have been a pack of dogmen, werewolves if you believe that sort of thing, whatever you want to call them. But they believe they got extremely lucky because had it not been for that scream, whatever that scream was from, they would all be dead. Personally, I believe that if those two wolf beings wanted those four boys dead, they would have done so long before they left. Is it possible that these beings smelt the odor of smoked cannabis on them and that is what attracted them? Or did they just so happen to walk through the territory of a pack of dogmen? What do you think? If you guys enjoyed today's video, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button, leave a comment down below, and if you're new to the channel and have not yet, be sure to subscribe because it really helps out the channel and it helps me get you guys some amazing stories you would not hear anywhere else. Stay tuned because I got a bunch of great content coming right up your alley. Be prepared for it.